Why did no one question the silence when her voice vanished from the radio? The night swallowed sound the moment she went dark. No final words, no static, just absence. For a sniper, silence was a tool. For a team pinned under fire, it felt like loss arriving early. The ruins of northern Syria shimmered green through night vision as the SEALs pulled back, step by careful step, obeying an order none of them wanted to hear. Extraction was moving. Time was gone. And somewhere behind them, alone in a shattered grain silo, she lay pressed against concrete, blood soaking into her plate carrier, breathing through pain that had not yet decided how bad it would become. They called her Revenant, not because she liked the name, but because it fit. She moved without sound. She stayed longer than anyone else. She never needed reminding to hold position when others shifted. Names were unnecessary out here. Names were for letters home. In the scope, she was function, distance, math. 11 pounds of rifle balanced against breath and gravity. Ambush hadn't announced itself. It never did. One moment the mission was clean, controlled, almost routine. The next, muzzle flashes stitched the dark from 3 directions, and extraction became survival. She'd already taken 3 down before the structure around her began to fail. The round that hit her shoulder didn't scream. It slammed. A blunt force that spun her sideways and stole her arm from her. She didn't cry out. She cataloged: clavicle, fracture, limited mobility, still breathing. When the lieutenant asked if she could move, she didn't answer immediately. She watched enemy movement through thermal, counted patterns, calculated distance to the rally point. She knew the math before she spoke, and the math said no. Negative, I'm locked down. The firefight below intensified. She heard the edge in their voices, heard someone start to move back toward her position. That was when fear arrived, not for herself but for them. Fear that loyalty would override logic, that doctrine would bend under emotion. "Don't come back for me," she said calmly. "Complete the mission." Silence followed, then command voices, sharp, controlled, heavy with consequence. She made the decision for them, turned off her radio, removed choice from the equation. When she pressed her back into the wall and the silence settled fully, it brought something unexpected. Calm. She was alone because she chose to be. The team lifted off 30 minutes later. 8 men stared at nothing inside a helicopter that vibrated with unresolved guilt. Her name was already turning into a file into a statistic. By the time the rotors stopped, she was officially dead. She lay still for hours after they left. Let the enemy sweep pass over her position. Let them believe what they wanted. Pain arrived in waves, but pain was familiar. Panic was not. Panic was loud. Panic made mistakes. When the first patrol relaxed, she moved. Slowly, methodically, left hand, elbow, knee, inch by inch, dragging herself into shadow. The night belonged to whoever respected it. She buried herself in mud when dawn threatened, used water to kill her heat signature, listened, waited. Patience was her weapon now. She didn't think about the memorial they would hold, didn't imagine her boots lined up neatly. She thought about rhythm, enemy habits, overconfidence. Every patrol had it. Every search grew sloppy with time. When she fired again, it wasn't desperation. It was decision. How does someone declare dead learn to move again when the world believes she's gone? The second day was harder. Not because of the wound, she had stabilized that, but because of doubt. Doubt crept in quietly. When the sun burned too hot, when her arm throbbed, when movement cost more than it gave back. She wondered if this was where stories ended, not with explosions but exhaustion. She pushed the thought aside. Doubt was a luxury. She moved during prayer calls when sound filled the air and attention drifted skyward, crawled through irrigation ditches, pressed herself into rubble fields that tore her uniform and skin equally. She counted steps in 10s, rested in 5s, every mile earned. Enemy chatter changed. Confusion replaced confidence. Posts went quiet, routes adjusted. She was no longer avoiding them. She was shaping them. Each obstacle removed was not revenge. It was geometry, survival as design. She carved a corridor through hostile territory, one deliberate action at a time, never rushed, never sloppy. The rifle felt heavier each hour, but it was also familiar, honest. By the time the base alarm screamed 3 nights later, she was no longer thinking about pain, only direction. When the floodlights hit her, she didn't stop, didn't raise her hands. Stopping meant collapse, and collapse could wait. Recognition arrived before words did. A guard's weapon lowered. Someone whispered her call sign like a prayer. She walked past them, leaving dried mud on concrete, eyes fixed forward. The operations center felt unreal. Too bright, too clean, too quiet. She placed the map on the table, then the magazine. "You're dead," someone said. She met his eyes. "You wrote me off." The room held its breath. She didn't accuse. She didn't explain yet. She let silence do the work. Let them see what survived abandonment looked like. When she spoke again, it wasn't anger that carried her voice. It was clarity. "I didn't wait for rescue." That truth changed everything. What does survival cost when no one is watching? She told them only what mattered. The wound, the wait, the crawl, the hunts. She didn't dramatize. Drama was for people who needed validation. She needed understanding. She explained the doctrine they all knew but had forgotten. Silence when compromised. Overwatch blind spots. Predictable patrol rhythms. She spoke like someone teaching from inside the lesson. When asked why she hadn't answered the radio, she looked at the lieutenant, not with bitterness, but something close to compassion. "Because I knew you'd come back." The words landed heavy. "I made the call so you wouldn't have to." There was no heroism in it, just responsibility, the kind that didn't ask permission. They saluted her before medics took her away, not because regulations demanded it, because something in them needed to acknowledge what had passed between declared death and earned return. Weeks later, protocols changed. Reports were rewritten. Lessons codified in policy language that would never capture the lived truth. She returned to Overwatch quietly, same role, same voice, but the team listened differently now. Trust had weighed again. They had written her name on a memorial. She erased it herself. What does it feel like to realize no one is coming for you, and still decide to move? The silence after the helicopter faded was heavier than the gunfire had been. It pressed down on her chest, not with panic but with finality. The kind that doesn't argue, the kind that simply exists. She lay still against the broken concrete, cheek pressed into dust that tasted like rust and old fire, listening to the night reorganize itself now that the fight was over. Voices drifted through the ruins below her, confident, relaxed. The enemy had decided the sniper was gone. She let them believe it. Pain finally arrived with intention. It didn't ask permission. It bloomed from her shoulder outward, sharp and electric, crawling down her arm and up her neck. She breathed through it the way she'd been trained, slow in, slower out, until it dulled into something manageable. Pain was information. Panic was noise. She had no use for noise. Her right arm was useless. She tested it once, felt the fracture protest, and didn't test it again. The rifle stayed where it was, supported by debris and careful placement. She tore fabric from the inside of her uniform with her teeth, looped it under the sling, cinched it tight with paracord. Crude, effective, good enough. Good enough was how you stayed alive. She checked her watch. Timelines mattered. Not for rescue, she'd already closed that door, but for patterns. Enemy patrol cycles. The rhythm of confidence after a perceived win. She waited. Minutes stretched. Hours softened. The first sweep came and went. Boots crunched below her position. A flashlight beam flicked briefly across a wall and moved on. They didn't look up. They rarely did. She stayed still long after she could have moved. Stillness was currency. Spend it too early and you went bankrupt fast. When she finally shifted, it was barely movement at all. An inch, then another. She rolled onto her left side, letting gravity help instead of fight her. Every movement was negotiated. Every breath was deliberate. She reached the edge of the structure just as dawn began to thin the darkness. Daylight was dangerous. Daylight stripped secrets away. She slid into a shallow depression filled with stagnant water and mud, eased herself down until only her face remained above the surface. The cold shocked her system, stole her breath for a second, then grounded her. Mud crept into her sleeves, her collar, her mouth. She welcomed it. Mud masked heat. Water lied to thermal optics. She stayed there as the sun climbed. Voices passed close enough that she could hear individual words, fragments of laughter, the scrape of metal. Someone paused near her position. She didn't move. Not when a shadow fell across her face. Not when something splashed nearby. Stillness wasn't bravery. It was discipline. Hours later, when the heat became unbearable and the patrols thinned, she rose like something dragged from the earth. Her uniform was unrecognizable now. Torn. Darkened, repaired already in places with wire and cord she'd scavenged without thinking. She didn't look like a soldier. That was an advantage. She began moving south. Every step was measured. She used the terrain the way others used maps. Low ground, broken walls, irrigation ditches that smelled of rot and fertilizer. She moved only when sound covered her. A passing truck, distant gunfire, the call to prayer echoing through villages like a veil. By nightfall, she had covered less than 2 miles. It felt like a victory. The second night tested something deeper than endurance. It tested belief. Not belief in survival, that was procedural, but belief in purpose. Why keep going when the world had already moved on, when reports were being written, when a name was being spoken in the past tense? The thought surprised her, not because it was new, but because it carried weight. She pushed it away and focused on the next observation post. 3 fighters, elevated position, overwatch on a dirt road she needed to cross. She watched them for hours, learning their habits. One paced, one smoked, one leaned too heavily on his weapon, trusting distance to protect him. Overconfidence was universal. It didn't belong to one side. She adjusted her rifle, shifted her body, ignored the scream from her shoulder as she lined up the shot left-handed. She waited for the wind to settle, for the moment when all 3 were exactly where she needed them to be. The suppressed shots were soft, almost polite. She didn't linger. By dawn, enemy movement had changed. Routes rerouted, voices sharper now. Something was wrong and they could feel it. She used that tension, that distraction, slipping through areas that would have been closed days earlier. She found water in a shattered building, stale but drinkable. She filtered it through cloth, swallowed slowly, resisted the urge to drink too much at once. Discipline again, always discipline. The third day blurred time. Fatigue set in like a fog. Her body moved on memory now, training layered over instinct. She caught herself drifting once, nearly stood when she should have stayed prone. The mistake scared her more than the pain ever had. She stopped and pressed her forehead into the dirt until the moment passed. By the time she reached the edge of friendly controlled territory, she no longer thought about being seen, only about not stopping. Stopping meant feeling everything she'd postponed. Stopping meant questions. When the alarm sounded, she didn't flinch, just kept walking. Inside the wire, faces blurred, voices overlapped. Someone shouted her call sign like it was impossible to say out loud. She focused on the building ahead, on finishing the walk. When she placed the map on the table, her hand shook for the first time. Not from fear, from release. Later, alone on a medical cot, as medics worked carefully around her injuries, she stared at the ceiling and felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. Not pride, not relief. Grief. For the version of herself that had accepted being forgotten so others could live. For the silence that had carried her home. And for the truth she understood now, more clearly than ever before. Sometimes survival isn't about being saved. Sometimes it's about refusing to disappear, even when everyone else already has. Why did coming back alive feel heavier than being left for dead? First night inside the wire, sleep refused her. Not because of pain, the medics had managed that, but because silence had changed shape. Out there, silence was protection. In here, it was crowded. It pressed in with voices she hadn't heard for days, with lights that never dimmed, with the knowledge that everyone now knew she existed again. She lay on the narrow medical cot, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the cracks, listening to the distant hum of generators and boots in hallways. Safety felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. Her shoulder throbbed in a deep, steady rhythm. The fracture was clean, they said, painful but survivable. That word again, survivable. She turned it over in her mind. Out there, survival had been action, decisions, movement. Here it meant waiting, being examined, being asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. They'd taken her rifle for cleaning and documentation. Watching it leave her hands had stirred something close to anxiety. The weapon had been constant, honest. It had never doubted her. People were different. She could hear voices outside the tent, familiar ones, lowered, careful. No one wanted to be the first to come in. She understood that hesitation. She felt it too. Coming back from the dead rearranged relationships. It forced people to confront decisions they'd buried under protocol and necessity. When the lieutenant finally stepped inside, he stopped just past the threshold. Rank meant nothing in that moment. He looked smaller somehow, older. His eyes carried 3 days of unanswered questions and one decision that had aged him years. "I should have waited," he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. Not because she didn't have words, but because timing mattered. He needed to finish the thought on his own. "You made the right call," she said finally. Her voice was rough, unused. "You followed doctrine." His jaw tightened. Doctrine doesn't put someone in a memorial. "No," she agreed, "but it keeps teams alive." He nodded once. The movement cost him. Guilt was heavier than any pack. She recognized it. She'd carried her own version through hostile ground. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for killing. Guilt for being capable when others were. "I went dark so you'd leave," she added, not unkindly. "I needed you too." That truth settled between them. It wasn't forgiveness he needed. It was context. Something to balance the weight he'd been carrying alone. He left without saying more. Some conversations ended better without closure. Word traveled fast through the base. Faster than official reports. Faster than corrections. She became a story before she could become herself again. Operators passed by the medical tent under the pretense of other tasks, glancing in like they expected her to vanish if they looked too hard. A few stopped, left coffee, left nods, left silence. The comms specialist came late, eyes red, hands restless. He stood near the foot of the cot, unsure where to put himself. "I saw the footage," he said, "the heat signature." She almost smiled, almost. "You weren't supposed to." He shrugged weakly. Didn't feel right not to look. She studied him for a moment. Young, sharp, still believed information could fix everything. "You did good," she said. "You paid attention." He swallowed. "We thought we were imagining it." "Most people do," she replied, "until they're forced not to." When he left, she closed her eyes and let exhaustion finally take something back. Sleep came in fragments. Not dreams exactly, more like echoes, mud, water, stillness. She woke once with her heart racing, convinced she'd heard boots too close. It took a full minute to remember where she was. The next days were a blur of evaluations. Physical, psychological, administrative. Each one peeling back layers she hadn't meant to expose. She answered questions carefully, aware that words could be as dangerous as silence. She didn't lie, she just didn't volunteer. They wanted details, how she moved, how she chose targets, how she kept going. She told them what mattered, left out what didn't. Because some things weren't meant for rooms with fluorescent lights. The base returned to rhythm around her. Missions launched. Briefings happened. Life went on with the quiet insistence of routine. She watched it from the edge, temporarily removed, her body healing faster than her sense of place. One afternoon, she asked for her rifle back. It came cleaned, catalogued, returned with care. She ran her fingers over the stock without thinking, felt the grooves, the marks, 12 of them now. She didn't count them consciously, she just knew. That night, alone again, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't out there. Anger. Not at being left, not at command, but at the whispers, the unspoken doubts she'd sensed even before the mission. The way some people questioned whether she belonged, whether her silence meant weakness, whether calm was the same as fragile. She hadn't survived to prove anything. But proof had a way of existing anyway. When she was cleared for light duty, she sat in on a briefing. Same room, same table, different weight in the air. Eyes followed her without meaning to. Voices adjusted when she spoke. Trust recalibrated itself. She noticed the changes and ignored them. Attention was a distraction. She focused on maps, on routes, on the quiet satisfaction of preparation. After the briefing, the chief stopped her in the hallway. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, arms crossed, looking at her like he was making sure she was solid. "You scared the hell out of us," he said finally. She nodded. Wasn't the plan. A corner of his mouth twitched. "You walked 40+ miles through hell and didn't think to warn anyone." "I warned you," she said softly. "I told you not to come back." He exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and something else. "You always were stubborn." "Disciplined," she corrected. "Same thing," he said. "Then more serious, you changed something." She met his eyes. That wasn't the goal. Still happened. That night she sat outside under the open sky, sling resting against her chest, coffee cooling untouched in her hand. The stars looked different here. Less sharp. Less honest. She thought about the space between being declared dead and choosing to live, about how thin that line really was. Survival hadn't been heroic, it had been patient, lonely, relentless. And now, being alive again required a different kind of strength. To stand in rooms where people measured you against their own fear. To carry what you'd done without letting it harden you. To return to Overwatch knowing you could disappear again at any moment. She finished the coffee, stood carefully, and headed back inside. Tomorrow she'd be back behind glass and scope, back where silence made sense. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't surviving alone. It's coming back and choosing to belong again. Why did the quiet feel heavier now that everyone was listening to her? The first mission back wasn't meant to matter. That's what they told her. Overwatch only. No direct contact. A slow reintegration designed to test readiness, not resolve. She accepted the assignment without comment because arguing would have suggested doubt, and doubt was something she could no longer afford. Still, as the helicopter lifted and the base shrank beneath them, she felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, memory. The air smelled the same. Oil, dust, heat. War never changed its scent, only its faces. She sat strapped in, helmet resting against the bulkhead, eyes closed but alert. Every vibration of the airframe traveled through her body, checking places still tender. Her shoulder held. The sling was gone now, replaced by careful physical therapy and discipline. Pain existed, but it was distant, managed, like everything else. No one spoke to her during the flight, not out of avoidance but respect. They'd learned that silence around her wasn't emptiness, it was space. She used it. When they inserted, she moved last, boots touching ground with practiced softness. The terrain was different from the last mission, rockier, more open, but the principles were the same. Find elevation. Find concealment. Become smaller than the world around you. She climbed without hurry, using her left arm more than she should have, adjusting when the shoulder protested. At the top, she settled in, rifle steady, scope downrange. The moment stretched, then snapped into place. "I'm set," she said into comms. Her voice was calm, always had been, but this time it landed differently. She felt it, heard the micropause before acknowledgement came back. People were listening harder now, measuring every word like it carried weight beyond coordinates and wind calls. She hated that. The target area below showed signs of recent activity. Too recent. Footprints not yet erased by wind. A vehicle track that didn't belong. She watched without moving, cataloging details. Patience again. Always patience. Hours passed. The team moved. She stayed. At one point, a patrol drifted closer than expected. Too close for comfort. Her finger rested near the trigger, not tense, just ready. She could end it. Clean, silent, but she waited. Timing mattered more than certainty. The patrol moved on, unaware of how narrow the margin had been. She exhaled slowly. In those moments, alone on Overwatch, memories crept in uninvited. The crawl through mud, the weight of the rifle after mile 30, the moment she'd realized she could disappear and no one would know until it was already history. She pushed the thoughts aside. They belonged to survival mode. This was something else. This was returning. When the mission ended without incident, relief passed through the team like a soft wave. Success measured not by action but absence of it. As they extracted, someone clapped her shoulder lightly without thinking, then froze in apology. She nodded, let it go. Back on base, reports were filed. Clean, efficient. Her name appeared again, this time without red text. Alive, operational, trusted. The system corrected itself quietly, as if embarrassed by its earlier certainty. But people didn't correct so easily. She noticed how eyes followed her now, not with doubt but curiosity, admiration, something like myth trying to form where a person still stood. She shut it down whenever she could. Short answers, no embellishment. She refused interviews, declined invitations she didn't need. Being elevated made her uncomfortable. One evening, she found herself alone in the gym, working through shoulder exercises under dim lights. The base was quieter than usual, between deployments, between losses. The chief walked in, watched her for a minute without announcing himself. "You don't slow down," he said. She kept moving. "I do, just not when anyone's watching." He smiled faintly. "Command wants you to speak at the next briefing, about survival, decision-making." She stopped, then met his eyes. "No." He expected resistance, but not that immediate. "They think it'll help." "It won't," she said. "They'll listen to the story, not the lesson." He studied her, then nodded. "Fair." Silence stretched between them, comfortable this time. "They put your boots away," he said eventually. "Took them off the memorial." She felt something tight and then ease. "Good." He hesitated. "You okay with that?" She considered the question. "I was never on it." That night she dreamed. Really dreamed. Not fragments, not echoes, a full scene. She was back in the grain silo, shoulder uninjured this time, watching the team move below. Everything went right. No ambush, no silence. She woke before dawn, heart steady, eyes dry. Progress, she decided. Days turned into routine. Training, missions, quiet competence. But something inside her had shifted. The line between alone and abandoned had sharpened. She understood it now in a way few ever would. Being left wasn't always betrayal. Sometimes it was trust in someone's strength. Sometimes it was survival math. Cold, necessary. But being forgotten, that was different. One afternoon, she overheard two junior operators talking near the armory. They didn't see her, didn't know she was close. "She's different," one said, after that. "Yeah," the other replied, "like she doesn't need us." She stepped into view. Both snapped to attention, mortified. She didn't correct them, just nodded and walked past. Later, sitting alone with her rifle, she thought about the comment, about independence mistaken for distance, strength mistaken for detachment. She wasn't above it. She made the same assumptions once. That was the quiet cost of survival. People saw what you could endure and assumed it meant you didn't feel. The next mission came faster than expected. Higher risk, less margin. Command wanted her there, not as symbol, as solution. She accepted without hesitation. Insertion was rough, weather turned, terrain unforgiving. On Overwatch again, she tracked movement through degraded visibility, adjusting for wind she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. Her shoulder held. Her mind was sharp. Then something went wrong. A miscommunication. A unit pushed too far, too fast. They were exposed. She saw it before anyone else did. "Stop," she said into comms. "You're walking into it." Confusion, then hesitation. "Trust me," she added, 2 words she rarely used together. They stopped. Moments later, enemy fire cut through the space they would have occupied. Silence followed, heavy, real. "Good call," someone said quietly. She didn't respond. She was already scanning for secondary threats. After extraction, the lieutenant approached her. Same man, different weight in his eyes now. "You saved them," he said. She shook her head. "I saw something, that's all." He didn't argue. That night, alone again under the stars, she allowed herself a small truth. She hadn't survived to prove she could do it alone. She survived so she could come back and choose when to stand with others. Strength, she realized, wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about returning, again and again, without letting the world harden you into something unreachable. And maybe that was the real mission. Not survival, but staying human after it. When did carrying everyone else's trust become heavier than carrying a rifle? It happened slowly, the way pressure always does. Not in a single moment, not with an order or a speech, but in glances held a second too long, in pauses after she spoke on comms, in the way people waited now, waited for her confirmation before moving, before deciding, before committing. Trust was a powerful thing. It saved lives. It also weighed something fierce. She felt it most on the days between missions, when there was time to think. The base had adjusted around her survival as if it were a structural change, subtle but permanent, procedures rewritten, assumptions challenged, silence treated differently. Operators no longer equated lost comms with lost hope. Someone always said it now, quietly, almost superstitiously. Give it time. No one needed to explain why. She never commented on it. She didn't want to become the reason people hesitated too long in the future. Survival had taught her one hard truth: delay could kill just as surely as action. The next operation came with a different tone. No drama in the briefing, no inflated language, just reality laid bare on a digital map. A village wedged between contested routes, high civilian presence, enemy elements using proximity as camouflage. No clean shots, no room for error. She studied the terrain while others talked, the angles, the rooftops, the lines of sight that looked good on paper and terrible in practice. Her finger traced a narrow alley on the screen, too narrow for vehicles, perfect for ambush. "This is where it breaks," she said quietly. The room went still. The lieutenant turned toward her. "Explain." "They'll wait until you're committed," she said. "Then close from behind. They won't shoot first. They'll let the environment do the work." No one questioned her. They adjusted the plan. That was the danger. Not that she might be wrong, but that no one challenged her anymore. On insertion, the air felt wrong, heavy, charged. She couldn't quantify it, only recognize it. Pattern recognition wasn't mystical. It was earned through repetition and consequence. She felt it now, the same way she'd felt the ambush days before she'd been declared dead. She took Overwatch from a fractured rooftop, concrete biting into her forearms. Through the scope, the village looked almost peaceful. Laundry moved in the breeze. A child chased something unseen across a courtyard. Normalcy wore a convincing mask. She adjusted her breathing, listened. The first sign wasn't visual, it was absence, a lack of sound where there should have been some. No dogs, no distant engines, too quiet. Hold, she said into comms. They froze. Seconds stretched. Then movement, subtle, a shadow shifting where it shouldn't, a reflection where no glass remained. She marked targets silently, waiting for confirmation that never came. Command, the lieutenant said, tension creeping in. We're exposed. She knew. She also knew if they pulled back now, the village would pay the price later. We stay, she said, but we change posture. Her voice was steady, but inside something cracked open. Responsibility, full and undeniable. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about consequence. The engagement was short, surgical, painfully restrained. Shots taken only when no other option existed. She fired twice. Both necessary, both final. She didn't celebrate either. Extraction was delayed by weather. They waited in place, nerves stretched thin. She stayed on overwatch, scanning through fatigue that burned behind her eyes. This was the edge survival never prepared you for, the long wait after decisions were made, when doubt had time to speak. They made it out before dawn. Back on base, the debrief was quiet. No congratulations, no raised voices, just acknowledgement of restraint, of discipline, of choices made under pressure that couldn't be undone. Later that night, she sat alone in the armory, rifle disassembled in front of her, cleaning it with methodical care. This ritual had always steadied her. Tonight, it didn't. She kept thinking about the village, about the child in the courtyard, about how close violence had come to spilling into spaces it had no right to occupy. Survival used to be simple. You lived or you didn't. Now it was layered. Now it echoed outward. A knock broke her focus. The comms specialist stood in the doorway, hesitant. He'd filled out since the last time she'd seen him. Less raw, more sure. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. She shook her head. He stepped inside, leaned against a rack. "They're talking about rotating you into planning." She looked up. "Why?" "Because when you say something feels wrong, it usually is." She considered that. "That doesn't make me infallible." "No," he agreed, "but it makes you valuable." She returned her attention to the rifle. "Be careful with that word." He frowned. "Why?" "Because valuable things get used until they break." The words surprised her, not because they weren't true, but because she'd said them out loud. He didn't respond immediately. Then softly, "You think that's what's happening?" She thought of the silence after her radio went dead. Of the moment she chose to keep moving when stopping would have been easier. Of the way people looked at her now, like resilience was a renewable resource. "I think," she said slowly, "that people forget strength has limits when it looks quiet." He nodded, understanding more than she expected. After he left, she finished cleaning the rifle and reassembled it with practiced ease. 12 marks on the stock caught the light. She ran her thumb over them once, then set the weapon aside. That night's sleep came easier than before, but it carried weight. Dreams of movement without destination. Of standing watch while others slept, trusting she would wake them if needed. In the days that followed, she pushed back where she could, asked questions, encouraged dissent, forced others to speak before she did in briefings. It was uncomfortable, necessary. On the next mission, she deliberately held back a call she could have made early. Let someone else see it first. They did. Confidence grew where dependence might have formed. That felt like success. Still, the internal struggle lingered. Pride and unease tangled together. She was proud of what she'd endured, proud of the discipline that had carried her home. But she was wary of becoming something singular, isolated again, this time not by distance but by perception. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, she stood on the perimeter wall and watched the desert cool. Heat lifted in waves, shadows stretched. She thought about the version of herself that had crawled through mud believing no one was coming. That woman had survived by refusing to disappear. This version had to survive something else. Expectation. She understood now that resilience wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about resisting the quiet erosion that came after, the subtle reshaping of identity by others' needs. She breathed in, breathed out. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another set of choices, another chance to balance silence and voice, independence and trust. She didn't need to be a symbol. She just needed to remain herself. And in a world that was always trying to define you by your hardest moment, that might be the most difficult mission of all. What happens after the world stops doubting you, but starts expecting you to be unbreakable? The question followed her into the final mission like a shadow that didn't care about light. It wasn't written into the briefing. It didn't appear on any map. But it was there, hanging between breaths, between glances, between the quiet trust she had earned and the danger of becoming more than human in other people's eyes. The operation was small by design, contained, surgical, a single objective along a transit route that had quietly become a lifeline for the wrong people. No spectacle, no room for error. The kind of mission that ended exactly how it began or didn't end at all. She took overwatch at dusk, the horizon melting into muted blues and grays. The rifle rested easily against her shoulder, familiar as memory. Her body had healed. Scars remained, but scars were honest. They didn't pretend nothing had happened. They simply marked where you'd been and let you move forward anyway. Below her, the team flowed through the terrain with practiced discipline. She watched each of them, not as assets, not as variables, but as people. People who trusted her voice. People who would move or stop based on what she saw. That trust no longer scared her. She realized that slowly as the mission unfolded without incident, as she made calls and others questioned them, as decisions passed back and forth instead of landing solely on her shoulders. This was different, balanced, healthy. At one point her scope settled on a figure that didn't fit, a hesitation, a pattern slightly off. She felt the old instinct flare, sharp and immediate. Possible contact, she said. Hold and verify. No urgency, no command, just clarity. The team adjusted. Another set of eyes confirmed what she'd seen. A threat dissolved into something else, movement, not malice. A moment that could have turned fatal, redirected by restraint. She felt a quiet satisfaction then, not pride, alignment. The mission concluded cleanly. No shots fired. No names added to reports that would be read once and forgotten. Extraction came smoothly, rotors lifting dust into the cooling air. As the helicopter rose, she looked down at the terrain one last time. Somewhere out there, years ago, a version of herself had moved through darkness believing she might never be seen again. That version had survived by refusing to surrender to absence. This one survived by choosing connection. Back on base, there was no ceremony, no speeches, just gear being stowed, weapons cleared, people dispersing toward showers and sleep. That suited her. Closure didn't need witnesses. She returned her rifle to the rack and paused, hand resting on the stock. 12 marks, a quiet ledger of nights that would never fully leave her. She didn't add another. She never would. Later, alone outside the barracks, she sat on the steps and watched the sky fade into stars. The desert cooled quickly now, the way it always did. Extremes defined it, heat and cold, noise and silence, survival and stillness. Footsteps approached. The lieutenant stopped beside her, not in front, learned behavior. "They're updating the doctrine again," he said. "Comms loss, KIA confirmation, Overwatch autonomy." She nodded, "Good." A pause, then, "You change things." She considered correcting him, decided not to. "Things change anyway," she said. "Sometimes people just notice." He smiled faintly. "You ever think about what happens when you stop doing this?" The question surprised her, not because it was new, but because it came without expectation. "Sometimes," she said, "but not the way people think." "How so?" She looked out at the dark. I don't think about leaving, I think about staying whole. He nodded, understanding enough. When he left, she stayed where she was, breathing in the night. The bass hummed behind her, alive, working, moving forward in small, imperfect ways. She thought about the memorial that had once held her boots, about the name written where it didn't belong, about how easily people accepted endings when they arrived neatly packaged. Survival had taught her that endings were rarely neat, that dignity wasn't loud, that strength didn't announce itself with speeches or symbols. Sometimes, dignity crawled through mud with a broken shoulder and no witnesses. Sometimes, strength went quiet so others could live. Sometimes, redemption didn't come from being remembered, but from returning without demanding recognition. She stood and headed inside, the door closing softly behind her. Tomorrow she would take over watch again, or maybe planning, or maybe nothing at all. She would adapt, she always had. Because the truth was simple, even if it took everything to learn it. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.